So I'm sitting here and I'm waiting for my guest and for the Solomon Atah podcast, and the guest has not yet come. And I get a WhatsApp saying that they are running late. Can I adjust the times? So I've adjusted the time and I'm waiting for the guest. So I'm sitting here and I want to share some thoughts. Something came to my head and I said, what happens when gender loses its stage? Let me begin with a simple question. What is gender when nobody can see it? What is gender when nobody can see it? Because I want to think whether is gender not reliant on its markers, its visual markers? How does someone that does not see or does not hear, how do they experience gender? How does someone that has a visual impairment and a hearing impairment, how do they experience gender? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Not when nobody believes it, not when nobody agrees with it, but when nobody can actually see it or hear it. Most of the time when we talk about gender, we talk about identity, expression, politics, or rights. We talk about masculinity and femininity, about fluidity, about performance. We talk about liberation or oppression. But rarely do we ask a more basic question. What actually holds gender together? What allows gender to exist as something we recognize? If we slow down and observe everyday life, something interesting appears. Gender depends on a very specific set of tools. It depends on visibility. It depends on sound. It depends on the body performing certain signals that others can read. Okay, let me say that again. Gender, if we slow down and observe, we observe the everyday life, something interesting starts to appear. Gender depends on a very specific set of tools. It depends on visibility, it depends on sound, it depends on the body performing certain signals that others can read. Clothing, hair, voice, posture, gesture, movement, tone, even silence. So you can describe these as gender markers. So it depends on clothing and costumes, the way the garments we wear, the way our hair appears, our voice, our posture, our gesture, movement, tone, even silence. And I'm sure you can start to see where I'm going with this. We're going to bring in Judith Butler very soon. Gender in many ways is a language spoken through the senses. Gender in many ways is a language spoken through the senses. Of course, Judith Butler is present. Judith Butler calls this gender performativity. Her argument was not that gender is fake, but that gender is something we continuously do. It is repeated behavior. It is rehearsed identity. It is the performance of norms that have already been written before we were born. I'm sure you know who Judith Butler is. Google Scholar can assist with this. But this is very interesting. Again, let's look at the markers. Clothing, hair, voice, posture, gesture, movement, tone, even silence. Gender in many ways is a language spoken through the senses. It is repeated behavior. It is rehearsed identity. It is the performance of norms that have already been written before we were born. And Simone de Beauvoir said something even earlier that remains powerful today. She said, and I quote, "One is not born, but rather one becomes a woman." That sentence is often quoted in gender theory, but what does it actually mean? It means that gender is not simply a biological fact, it is a process. A person learns to become a man or a woman through the scripts available in their society. So basically, it is what the society says that this is a man or this is a woman as they have been performing within that body that makes them a man or a woman. Excuse me. And here is where that thought experiment begins. This is where I come in with my own. So I want to throw a spanner in the works, literally. I have a big spanner. I want to throw it in the works of Judith Butler, Simone de Beauvoir. I want to throw a spanner in the works with this thought. Think about a body that cannot rely on these sensory anchors. A blind body, a deaf body, a deaf-blind body, a body that cannot see the gestures of masculinity or femininity, a body that cannot hear the tone of a masculine voice or a feminine voice. How does that body learn gender? How does that body perform it? And more importantly, how does society recognize it? Because gender, as we know it, depends heavily on recognition, it requires other people to read the signals. Without recognition, performance becomes unstable. Let me say that again. Without recognition, these various signals, performance becomes very unstable. Imagine trying to perform a play in a dark room where no one can see the stage and no one can hear the actors. At some point, the performance loses its meaning. This is where the idea of degendering begins to emerge. Degendering does not mean the body suddenly becomes neutral or free from social expectation. I say that again. Degendering does not mean the body suddenly becomes neutral or free from social expectation. It means the architecture that normally supports gender starts to weaken. It means that the architecture that normally supports gender starts to weaken. If gender cannot be seen, cannot be heard, cannot be mirrored or imitated, its structure begins to lose form. And when that happens, something interesting occurs. Society tends to fall back on something much simpler. I'm sure you can guess. When that happens, society starts to look for some kind of anchors to hang on to, and it's something much, much simpler. Biology. In the absence of the visible performance, classification replaces expression. The body becomes male or female again, not because it performs masculinity or femininity, but because institutions need a category. Hospitals ask a simple question, male or female. Passports ask a simple question, male or female. Legal systems ask a simple question, male or female. So what we see is not disappearance of gender, but it collapses back into sex classification. This is the paradox. When gender loses its stage, it does not necessarily liberate the body. Instead, the body may be pushed back into rigid biological binaries. I know this territory is very, very contested. It's contested territory, but I'm sure that, like I said at the beginning, these are my thoughts. If gender is becoming, Simone de Beauvoir, if gender is performativity, Judith Butler, and when it loses its markers, how can someone that does not see, if you cannot see it, if you cannot hear it, how do you experience gender? When gender loses its stage, it does not necessarily liberate the body. Instead, the body may be pushed back into the rigid biological boundary, man or woman. In other words, when gender cannot be performed, it becomes administered. Now, this raises deeper philosophical questions. Was gender ever fluid, as we sometimes imagine, or was it always anchored to systems of recognition that required constant sensory confirmation? Was gender ever fluid, as we sometimes imagine, or was it always anchored in systems of recognition that required constant sensory confirmation? Think about how quickly we assign gender when we meet someone. Think about it. When we meet someone, a body walking about, we are quick to assign gender to that body walking about. Is it based on the garments, the hair, the tone? What is it based on? We look at hair, clothing, posture, facial expressions, or facial features. We listen to voice, we read gestures. And we can then use these to assign gender. All of this happens in a second, like in a split second. Gender recognition is incredibly fast sensory process. Remove these signals and the system begins to panic. And this is where things become politically, culturally interesting, especially in post-colonial or post-apartheid societies. Because these societies have already gone through moments where identity structures collapsed, colonial regimes imposed very rigid categories. Race as classified, gender roles are structured, bodies are disciplined into specific hierarchies. When those regimes fall, many societies had to negotiate identity. Who belongs where, who represent tradition, who represent modernity. Gender became part of that negotiation. In political documentary films across post-colonial societies, gender is often presented as evidence of cultural authenticity or political struggle. Women become symbols of resilience or tradition. Men become symbols of authority or resistance. Bodies appear on screen as visual proof of a social order. But film itself is a sensory medium. It depends on sight and sound. So documentary cinema does something interesting. It reinforces gender legibility. It frames the body in ways that makes gender readable. Again, if you cannot read gender, how can you experience gender? If you cannot read gender, how can you experience gender? How does someone that cannot hear, cannot see, how do they experience gender? The camera becomes part of the machinery that stabilizes gender. The viewer sees a woman speaking, the viewer hears a man's voice, the narrative aligns with familiar scripts. But occasionally, documentary film captures bodies that disrupts these scripts. Bodies that are hard to categorize. Bodies whose gestures do not follow the familiar patterns. Bodies whose sensory presence challenges the viewer's expectation. In those moments, the viewer begins to ask a question that is rarely spoken out. What exactly am I looking at? And that question exposes something fragile about gender. It reveals that Gender is not simply an internal identity. It is a shared agreement about what certain bodies are supposed to look like, sound like, and do. Without that agreement, gender becomes unstable. Now, let me push the thought experiment even further. Imagine in a world where visual and auditory gender signals were suddenly stripped away. No clothing codes, no voice cues, no hairstyles or aesthetic markers that we associate with masculinity and femininity. How would we recognize gender? Would it disappear? Or would institutions simply tighten the grip on biological classification? My suspicion is the second outcome. The system would not tolerate ambiguity for very long. It would reassert the binary through biology. Not because biology is destiny, but because institutions require stability. They require clear categories in order to function. So the degendered body reveals something uncomfortable. Gender might not dissolve when its performance collapses. Instead, it might revert to the most rigid form of classification available. And that realization challenges both traditional and progressive assumptions. Traditional views assume gender is naturally fixed. Progressive views often assume that removing gender norms leads to freedom. But the degendering thought experiment suggests a third possibility. Gender is neither natural nor easily liberated. It is infrastructural. It exists because an entire network of sensory cues, social rituals, institutions, and cultural expectations constantly hold it together. Remove enough of those supports, the structure either collapses or hardens. Either it becomes unintelligible or it becomes brutally simplified. So when we ask the question, what is gender anyway, we may need to shift the frame. Maybe gender is not simply identity. Maybe gender is not simply performance. Maybe gender is a sensory contract between bodies and society, a contract maintained through visibility, audibility, and recognition. And when that contract breaks, the system reveals a deeper logic, not freedom, not fluidity, but the tension between ambiguity and control. That tension may be one of the most important questions of our time, especially as societies continue to renegotiate identity, embodiment, and the politics of representation. Because at the end of the day, the question is not only about gender, the question is about how societies make bodies legible. And what happens when a body refuses or simply cannot participate in that system of legibility? That is where the conversation about degendering truly begins. These are my thoughts. This is what I think. I have been grappling with this since 2021, 2022, I think, trying to make sense of it. And the big one is, if you remove the sensory markers of gender, what are you left with? And I've already anchored this argument between Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler. I would like to hear what you think. I would like to hear what you think. What is gender? I will see you in the next video.